After the Allies liberated the concentration camps, Jewish survivors and small numbers of others, gays, gypsies, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, remained for months, and some for years, in camps, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, this time American or British, and their status had become displaced persons. Some survivors remained in camps for up to 6 years. Nations, like the United States, did not want to change their immigration laws to allow the survivors in any more than they had wanted the German Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis in the 1930s. In the months after liberation, thousands of survivors died of ill health or malnutrition, and American commanders refused to give extra rations to Jewish Holocaust survivors for fear of being criticized for showing favoritism to Jews compared with German POWs. Once Jewish organizations in the United States learned of the miserable treatment of Holocaust survivors by American troops, they petitioned President Harry Truman to take action. Truman appointed a special emissary and former immigration official, Earl Harrison. He reported back on the conditions and told Truman in the summer of 1945 that survivors, quote, have been liberated more in military sense than actually. Further, he reported to the president that, quote, as matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under military guard instead of SS troops. Harrison's report enraged General George Patton, who had command responsibility for the survivors in camps in Germany. Harrison and his ilk, wrote Patton in his private journal, believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not, and this applies particularly to the Jews, who are lower than animals. Patton thought Jews live in filth like lazy locusts, and spoke despairingly of having to take General Eisenhower, his commanding officer, to a makeshift synagogue that held, quote, the greatest stinking mass of humanity I have ever seen. Patton could not stand the Jews, but admired the Nazi prisoners his command guarded as well. He told his junior officers that if they need to keep control of the Jewish displaced persons, to mingle Jewish survivors with the German POWs, and put the Germans in charge, including Nazi Party members. For Patton, the Nazis knew how to keep the filthy Jews under control. In response to the report by Harrison, President Truman ordered changes in the camps. Conditions slowly improved, and synagogues and schools appeared in the displaced persons' camps. To help Orthodox Jews, religious schools developed in the camps, including Bergen-Belsen. Jewish NGOs began to assist the survivors, providing social services and helping to find surviving relatives. Some of the restrictions mandated by the military also eased, to the annoyance of some military commanders like Patton. However, as one journalist and historian, Eric Lightblau, concluded, malaise set in, as survivors realized they had no place to go. Soon after the war ended, the Allies sent back to their home countries over 6 million displaced persons. Some were unwilling to return to Soviet-controlled territories, especially the USSR, but were required to go back because of Allied agreements. Another 1.5 million to 2 million refused repatriation, and the Allies and the United Nations assumed responsibility to provide food and housing for the refugees until places for permanent resettlement could be located. When Jews tried to return home, locals attacked them for daring to survive the Holocaust. The worst pogrom took place in Kielce, Poland, in 1946, resulting in the deaths of 42 Holocaust survivors. Jews returning to other towns in Poland also came under attack, leading to further murders of Jews for the crime of surviving the final solution. After Kielce, most Holocaust survivors from Poland and several other Eastern European countries refused repatriation or quickly left after receiving a hostile reception in their former hometowns. Jews preferred to go west to the British and American occupation zones in Germany and Austria. From 1945 to 1952, the lack of alternatives led over 250,000 Jewish displaced persons to reside in camps in the American and British zones of occupation in Germany and in camps in Austria and Italy. The Allies and the newly created United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency assumed responsibility to administer the camps. Congress did not want to act on legislation for displaced persons in 1945 or 46 because the continued anti-Semitism in the United States, especially among Southern Democrats and some Republicans. Truman issued a directive in December 1945 that allowed about 900 Jews held at the Fort Ontario Refugee Shelter who came to the United States in 1944 to stay in the country by applying for regular immigration status, and he allowed thousands of Polish Catholics forced to stay in Mexico after the outbreak of the war to come to the United States. Truman's directive allowed a total of 41,000 displaced persons into the United States, including about 28,000 Jews. The president felt he could go no further without specific congressional action. Unable to move Congress to act, he pushed the British to open up Palestine for survivors. Great Britain resisted, but agreed to an Anglo-American Committee on Inquiry. This binational committee urged the admission of 100,000 survivors to Palestine, but the British government rejected the recommendation for fear that admitting additional Jews to Palestine would further enrage the Arab population in nearby Arab nations like Syria and Egypt. Some British staff members preferred to keep the Jews in displaced persons camps until they tired of the camps and agreed to accept resettlement in any country that would accept them. When the Republicans took control of Congress after the November 1946 off-year elections, they did not want to alienate anti-Semitic constituents by opening the doors to Jewish refugees or other potential immigrants among the displaced persons in Europe. Most Southern Democrats concurred, and Congress delayed action for 2 years. In 1948, Congress finally did act and passed the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed 200,000 war refugees entry, but severely limited the number of Jews who could immigrate. Authors of the legislation made clear they wanted ethnic Germans and agricultural workers, not Jews. Additional amendments in 1950 increased the total to 400,000. President Harry Truman, in his special message to Congress on June 28, 1948, noted the discriminatory provisions of the law. The bill discriminates in a callous fashion against displaced persons of the Jewish faith. This brutal fact cannot be obscured by the maze of technicalities in the bill. President Truman noted that 90% of Jewish displaced persons could not enter the United States under the law, and the remaining 10% would run into other technical difficulties in actually seeking admission. As the president concluded, for all practical purposes, it must be frankly recognized, therefore, that this bill excludes Jewish displaced persons. The Republican authors of the bill also had problems with Catholics, and President Truman observed, quote, "The bill also excludes many displaced persons of the Catholic faith who deserve admission." To counter the discriminatory provisions of the legislation, Truman appointed liberals to head the Displaced Persons Commission, who let more survivors in. In 1950, the law was amended, removing the most discriminatory provisions. By the end of 1952, 415,000 displaced persons entered the United States, and 16%, about 63,000 people, were Jewish. A second Displaced Persons Act passed Congress in 1952 that admitted an additional 200,000 refugees from 1953 to 1956, including about 15,000 Jews. By 1952, most American Jewish organizations no longer worried about refugees because the majority of Jewish survivors in displaced persons camps ended up in the new state of Israel. British policy allowed a small number of Jews to legally enter Palestine from 1945 to 1948. About 150,000 survivors were smuggled into Israel by Operation Aliyah Bet, although initially the British blockade prevented most Jews from reaching Palestine, and about 50,000 ended up in the internment camps in Cyprus until the establishment of Israel in May 1948. Some, like the famous refugee ship Exodus, that carried 4,500 Holocaust survivors from France in July 1947, never made it to Palestine due to the British blockade, and the British sent the refugees on the Exodus back to internment camps in Germany, as they did with several other ships they caught smuggling Jews into Palestine. The creation of Israel allowed the survivors to legally enter Israel, and for the most part ended the Jewish refugee issue, combined with the 1950 amendments to the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. By 1952, the Allies and the UNRRA closed most of the displaced persons camps.